Hello everyone. In this following video we are going to find out how to solve rational equations. The first thing that we are always going to do is we are going to find the least common denominator. The best way to do this is by factoring. So we need to again know how to factor polynomials. Secondly, we are going to find the bad numbers, the restrictions, those values that x cannot be equal to because it would turn a denominator equal to 0. How do we do this? We are simply setting the denominator equal to 0 and solve. Next, we are going to use the least common denominator by multiplying both sides with this and therefore eliminating the denominators. We will see how this works. Then we will have an equation that we can solve. And once we have solved this equation, we have to be careful. This last step right here is going to be the most important step. We have to ignore all solutions that were found in step 2. In other words, that were restrictions. So it could possibly happen that you find 2 solutions in step 4, but only one of them is going to be good because one of them was a restriction. Or, worst case scenario, all of the solutions that you find in step 4 were restrictions, and that would mean then that the equation did not have any solutions whatsoever. So let's do an example. We want to solve this equation right here. So the first thing that we're going to do, we're going to find the least common denominator between 2x, 18, and 3x. And the way to do this is, if I can factor it, I will. The top one was not factorable. This one, 18, is 2 times 9, and 9 is 3 times 3. And I still have 3x. And now what I do to find the least common denominator, I just pick factors as they come. The first ones have to always come. Now I go to the second denominator. I do not have to take factors that I had already. The factor of 2 does not come. A factor of 3 has to come because I didn't have it yet. And there is even a second factor of 3. This also have to come. Now I go to the last denominator, 3x. I see that I had already a factor of 3 in it. That does not have to come. There was already a factor x. That also doesn't have to come. So in other words, my least common denominator is 18x. So what I'm going to do right now, I'm going to take my equation. And just because I can, I just copy this one right here. And what I will do now, I will take the right side and the left side, and I will multiply both sides by this 18x, by the least common denominator. So what happens right now here, on the left side, you'll see that when this actually is being multiplied, the x's cancel out, and the 2 on the bottom is also going to cancel out and will turn this into 9. Now, on the right side, what is going to happen is that I will have to use my distributive property. That means everything gets to multiply with 18x. So let's write down what we have at this point. On the left side, I will have 9 times 5. The 2x cancels out. All of this is going to be equal to, well, let's write down this step. 18x times 17 over 18. And you see already what is going to happen. The negative sign stays. 18x times 1 over 3x. And what is happening now here is this. This equation will turn out nicely. 9 times 5 on the left side, well, that is 45. On the right side now, we use the color blue to cancel. This 18 goes away, and I'm left with x times 17, which is nothing else but 17x. Then I look further to the next term. The x's cancel out. These are factors. And the 3 is also going to go away. 18 divided by 3, one moment, that will be 6. So I have left a negative 6 times 1, which is a negative 6. This equation now that I have found right here, this is the one that I will solve. So this is a fairly quick one to be solved. All what I do is I will add 6 to both sides, and I will get 45 plus 6, that should be 51, is equal to 17x. Now I simply divide both sides by 17. Let's see, 51 divided by 17, that should be 3. And I have found a solution. But be careful. As I mentioned, if you now just blindly say that the solution to the equation is 3, then you forgot one step. I always have to remember that I originally wanted to solve, one moment, let me move it a little bit in. The equation that we wanted to solve was this one. And we have not actually checked for restrictions. We have forgotten to do this. That was supposed to be the second step. So what are the restrictions in this case? The restrictions is what we were supposed to do in the second place. A lot of times this gets forgotten. So what are we supposed to do? We simply can take the denominators and set them equal to 0. There is 2x, which is equal to 0. Well, 18, that can never be equal to 0 because there is no variable in it. And then we had 3x is equal to 0. So this part right here, that will not give us any restriction. But the left and the right one, I divide both sides by 2. I divide both sides by 3. And I get that x is equal to 0. Would turn the denominators into 0. So the restriction is 0. Now, the solution that we found was 3. And because 3 was not a solution, we actually have found a solution to this equation, and the solution set consists out of the number 3. Always check your solutions back here that you find with the restrictions. Don't forget this last step. All right, let's do another one. Here's an equation that we want to solve. So first, let's find the least common denominator. Well, there is really only one denominator there, and that is the denominator x. So the least common denominator is going to be x. Now, let's not forget this time that we are supposed to find the restrictions. And the restrictions are in this case that x cannot be equal to 0. This is the only bad number right here, because if x is equal to 0, I would have to plug it in right there, and that doesn't work because the denominator is never allowed to be 0. Now we can move on with the next step. I'll take my equation, and just like before, I will multiply both sides by the least common denominator, which we found to be x. Now I will use my distributive property. Everything gets to be multiplied by x, and I will have x times x. Now that will be x squared. X times, let me write down this step, x times 6 over x. You see that this x on the denominator will now cancel out. And on the right side, I get a negative 5 times x, which is just negative 5x. Now here, the x's cancel out. and I will have this equation here. X squared plus 6 is equal to negative 5x. This is the equation that we are now going to solve. This is a quadratic equation. We have learned how to solve quadratic equations in the last chapter. The way to do this is by factoring, by first setting everything equal to 0. And the way to set this equal to 0 is just to simply add 5x to both sides. I will add 5x to both sides, and the equation that I will get right now is x squared plus 5x minus plus 6 is equal to 0. This will work out just fine. This is a perfect example because this polynomial now can be factored. I have said this before. Factoring will be the most important thing that you need to know how to do. So this is going to be x plus 2 times x plus 3. I double check before I move on. 2 times 3 is 6. 2x plus 3x is 5x. And x times x is x squared. Now I use my property a times b is equal to 0. That means a is equal to 0 or b is equal to 0. In other words, I set the first factor equal to 0. And I set my second factor equal to 0. This goes really quickly. I subtract 2. I subtract 3. And I have now 2 proposed answers. The numbers negative 2 and negative 3. Both theoretically could be working, but what do I not forget? I have to check with my restrictions. So where are my restrictions? I had only one right here. X could not be equal to 0. Remember, because we had this x inside the denominator, but because the answers that we found were not 0, both of these numbers are good and valid solutions. So I have a solution set, and the solution set consists out of the two numbers, negative 3 and negative 2. I could plug those ones into the original equation and it would turn it into a true statement. All right, let's do one more. Here's a very interesting one. We are supposed to solve x divided by x minus 3. All of the left side is supposed to be equal to 3 divided by x minus 3 plus 9. So we are just following the same steps as before. Least common denominator. Well, there is only one denominator really showing up, and that is x minus 3. And that makes x minus 3 the least common denominator. Now, what are the restrictions? The restrictions I find by setting the denominator equal to 0. Since they were both the same, I don't need to do this 2 times. I solve this by adding 3 to both sides, and I get that x is equal to 3. 3 would be the value that makes the denominator 0, but in the end, this is a restriction, so whatever my solutions will be, it better not be the number positive 3. Now I just move on by doing the exact same thing as before. I will take my equation and I will multiply the left and the right side by the least common denominator, which was x minus 3. So I see already on the right side that I will have to multiply both terms by x minus 3. What is happening on the left side? This is nice. This x minus 3 is completely canceling out. And the only term that is left is one single x. Now on the right side, I will have 3 divided by x minus 3 multiplied by x minus 3 plus 9 times x minus 3. So this x minus 3 right here is also canceling out. And overall, the equation that we will now solve looks like this. X is supposed to be equal to 3 plus 9 times x minus 3. This right here is the equation that we are now going to solve. So we are just following the steps how to solve a linear equation. That means we are simplifying first. On the right side, I could use my distributive property. 9 times x makes it 9x. 9 times a negative 3, well, is a negative 27. Now I have two terms that can be combined. X is equal to 3 minus negative 3 minus 27. That would be a negative 24, if I'm not mistaken. Now I am subtracting 9x to move the x's to the left side. And I will get, a moment, let me move this a little bit up. I will get, let's see, a negative 8x is equal to a negative 24. Last step, I divide everything by negative 8, and I will get x is equal to negative 24 divided by negative 8. That will be a positive 3. All right, so I end up with positive 3. And here's now the thing. If you now type in that the answer was positive 3, then you forgot something. Because this is an example of where it is extremely important that I will check my restrictions. This is the answer that I found, but hold on. We have found that the answer could not be positive 3. 3 was a restriction. And 3 is the only number that we found. And that means that this equation does not have a solution. There is no solution for this. All right, let's do a last one. This one is one that looks a little bit longer. Well, I think we are ready for it. So, we are following the same steps. I'm looking at the denominator x squared minus 25. I have a denominator x plus 5, and I have a denominator of x minus 5. I see that x squared minus 25 is the difference of two squares. That means it can be factored. And that means now that the least common denominator is, I pick both factors from my first denominator. I move on and I check my second denominator. I have this factor already right here. I don't need it again. There is an x minus 5. I also have this one. That means x plus 5 times x minus 5 is the least common denominator. Now we move on to find restrictions. Well, we said we just have to set the denominators equal to 0. If I just look at the first one, x plus 5 times x minus 5, set this one equal to 0, then I see that either the first or the second factor has to be equal to 0, and that means that one restriction is negative 5, while the second restriction is positive 5. So, whatever x is going to end up being, it cannot be plus or minus 5. This is the fastest way how we write plus or minus, just putting them both in front of the 5. All right, now we move on, doing the same steps as before. Math always works like this. You just always do the same thing again. All right, so the left side is going to be multiplied with x plus 5 times x minus 5. The right side is going to be multiplied with x plus 5 times x minus 5. Now, to make this a little bit shorter, on the left side right here, x squared minus 25, remember that in the factored form, that was x plus 5 times x minus 5. And that means that on the left side, this whole x squared minus 25 is going to cancel out. And I'm just going to be left with 4x. Now, on the right-hand side, the first one, let me use a different color. The first term is going to be multiplied with x plus 5 times x minus 5. X plus 5 times x minus 5. And you see already what is going to happen. This x plus 5 in the bottom is going to go away. Now, a negative x plus 5 times x minus 5 times 2 over x minus 5. This negative sign right here, if you're wondering about that one, that is just this negative sign here. All right, and cancels out, cancels out, cancels out. Whoops, that was the wrong one. And it cancels out with the x plus 5. So again, I'm writing down the equation that I actually am going to solve. And that equation looks like this. 4x is equal to x minus 5 times 1 minus x plus 5 times 2. This is the equation we are now going to solve. So all of the steps before were just to end up with this. All right, we are simplifying. 4x is equal to x minus 5. 2 times x, but a negative. 2 times 5 is 10, but a negative 10. And I am now combining like terms. X minus 2x is a negative 1x. Negative 5 minus 10, that is a negative 15. I'm adding x to both sides. Plus 1x, and we are getting that 5x is equal to negative 15. Divide both sides by 5. Be careful with the sign. Negative 15 divided by 5 is negative 3. Before I mark this as the answer, I go back and I check with my restrictions. All right, it is not negative 5 or positive 5, and that means that we have a solution to this equation, and the solution consists out of the number negative 3, and that is it.